Good evening. We're ready to jump into our study as we continue going through an overview of the Old Testament. In so doing, we are working our way through the book of Judges right now. And I say that very sparingly because we're not really working our way through Judges. We're giving a very, very brief recap. We didn't quite get all the way through everything last Sunday. I just want to cover the last couple narratives before we move on from Judges, because they are extremely important moving forward. As we said last week, we're not going to cover them in depth, especially the second of the two narratives. We're going to save the details of that one for a time in which younger ears are not here soaking up the discussion. Because there are some things there that are meant for an audience, that at least it's probably PG-13, 12 around in there, and up. So we'll dig into it at some point, but not necessarily in this particular setting. So as we begin, why don't we begin with a prayer together, and then we'll jump into our study. Let's bow. Father in heaven, we ask that you would be with us this evening. Help us to gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of your word. We thank you that you have given it to us, that we have it to look to understand who you are as our God and what the sacrifice of your Son really means. We thank you for Jesus, and through him we pray. Amen. All right, as we jump into this, if you recall last week, we looked at what we would call the 6 major judges. And in the 6 major judges, they follow this kind of pattern that loops again and again. Everything's fine. Israel sins. God raises an oppressor. Israel cries out. They get a deliverer. And then things are fine for X number of years, until it goes again. But we also said that the judges cycle, although accurate, may not be the best term, because as you work your way through all of these narratives, what happens to the moral quality of these deliverers? It goes down, right? You get to a point where you get around Gideon, and you're kind of on a balanced teeter-totter, seesaw or whatever you guys call it around here. It's pretty good on either side, but then the scales tip with Jephthah, and then finally Samson. And I've heard a better term would be the judge's spiral, because things just spiral downhill throughout, so that by the time that you get to the end, things are really bad. I've heard some people describe it more, if you want to think about it, as a toilet bowl. And you think that the stuff down in the bottom that's settled to the bottom of the toilet bowl is a lot worse than the stuff on top. That's not a bad way to think of the judges. It is a time period in Israel's history where you'd rather just flush it out and be done with it. That is the way that things kind of go. The book of Judges, if you had one word to describe the book of Judges, what would that be? Someone up here, throw it out for me. Failure. Yes. They failed from the very beginning. They failed to drive out the inhabitants. They failed. And this entire book is all about their failure to uphold their covenantal relationship with God. And then you get to the end. Now you have these 2 narratives at the end of Judges, starting in chapter 17. At Judges chapter 17, we are breaking the chronological follow-through of the story. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? All of these occur in chronological order. Othniel was the first, Samson was the final judge. That all makes sense. You get to chapter 17, though, and the story of the judges is complete. It's done. It's finished. We're not adding to the story anymore. Now we have kind of like an epilogue of sorts. I hate to use that word because it sounds like something that's just simply tacked on, but it is different. And it serves a specific purpose that we may or may not get to tonight. We'll see. But this ends the timeline of Judges' history. So don't assume that when you look at chapter 17, you're reading the events that take place after Samson. We're not. In fact, I think chapters 17 and 18 go all the way back to the very beginning of Judges. These are events that are taking place in the very beginning. Why would I possibly say that? Those of you who have looked at Judges chapter 17 and 18 recently, maybe, thought about them on Thursday night or something like that. Why would I assume that this might go all the way back to the beginning of the Judges' story, chronology? Okay, say that again. Because I think you were right, but I only caught about half the words you said. Okay, in those days, Josie said, in those days, the tribe of Dan was seeking an inheritance for itself. When do they do that? Do they wait until the time of Samson to go out and find a place? No, this is something that they do after what?
Conquest.
Okay, when they
messed up and got put in their place by after the conquest and after they messed up and got put in their place by the other tribes.
All right, so after their conquest, after they failed to go into the land that was allotted to them, and they didn't get any of it, so they had to find a place to go, and that's what sets up chapters 17 and 18. However, chapter 17 begins, and this is an important phrase. In those days, what? What does it say? In those days.
Do you mean chapter 18?
Okay. There's a chapter 17 verse, no, it's in here. 6, thank you. I thought I was on 6. No, I was on 5. That's what it was. In those days, yes, verse 6. The beginning phrase of chapter 17 is going to be important for the reason that I alluded to earlier that I said we're pushing back. We'll come back to chapter 17, verse 1. Sorry about that. Yeah, chapter 17, verse 6. Thank you, John. What does it say there? In those days, what?
There was no king in Israel, but every man did what was right in his own eyes.
All right. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This phrase is going to be kind of repeated multiple times. Chapter 18, verse 1, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Chapter 19, verse 1, in those days, there was no king in Israel. I believe it's another place, but I want to look at chapter 21, 25. How does Judges end? What's the very, very last phrase in the book of Judges? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we have this phrase that marks all of these narratives. This is what is going on. This is what it's all about. You see, this serves as an inclusio of sorts with reminders throughout that says, hey, we're talking about a time in which there was what? All right, there's no king in Israel. In those days, there was no king, which means that there was, what does that mean? It's not that they didn't have a person sitting on a throne, it's that they what? They didn't recognize anybody's authority. Everyone did what was right in his eyes. And that's kind of what you see as you work your way, especially down here, as you get towards the bottom. Remember what Samson, remember what he said about this woman, this Philistine woman, to his parents? Get her for me, for she is what? She is right in my eyes. And that's why I lamented the fact that some translations try to help you understand what that phrase means. And they say, get her for me because she looks good to me, or I desire her. And I wish they would just translate the words that are there, because those are important for the continuing narrative. Samson is a representation of the type of people who just simply want what is right in their eyes. That's Samson. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, as opposed to what? This one's not a hard one. What's that, Josie? All right, what is right in God's eyes? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, as opposed to what was right in God's eyes. All right, so this first narrative, chapter 17, and I want to be very brief as we look through this. It begins, there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And this man steals money from his mother and finally fesses up with it. And she says, oh, what a good boy I have. Let me take this silver and do what with it? In verse 3? Let me make a carved image and a metal image. So, this immediately is starting out with what? Idolatry. This is a violation of rule number 2 right here. This is how the story begins. This is going to end well, isn't it? No. Yeah, of course not. And so, verse 5, the man Micah had a shrine, made an ephod, and household gods, ordained one of his sons who became his priest. What does this sound like? Ordaining as a priest, having an ephod. It sounds like the tribe of Levi, right? And the Levitical priesthood. And he says, I'm going to copy it. I'm going to use that. And this is going to be our God. Verse 6. This is the type of thing that you would expect if what? If there's no king in Israel and everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. Verse 7, now there's a young man from where? Bethlehem. That's going to be important to remember. There's a young man from Bethlehem. So far we've been given 2 areas, and we're going to come back to these later. The hill country, right? Of where? All right, the hill country of Ephraim. And then, now we have Bethlehem. And I don't know, I'm standing too close to see if I spelled those correctly. Y'all can correct me later if I messed it up. All right, so we have these 2 places so far. I'm running out of order. I'm going to start erasing stuff soon as far as the Judges cycle, stuff like that. We're kind of past that. So now you have this young man from Bethlehem who was there within the family of Judah. But what was he? He was a what? He was a Levite. So he sojourned there. The man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to go where he could find a place. And so he journeyed. He came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. And Micah says, who are you? He lets him know, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem. I'm going to find a place. And Micah's like, dude, seriously? You're a real Levite? I tell you what, I will hire you with a good price, give you good clothing, if, verse 10, you will stay with me, be a father to me, and a priest. So, why does Micah want him to stay there and be his priest? Didn't he already make his sons his priest? Kelly?
He knows what he did wasn't legitimate.
Okay. Yeah. He recognizes that he's kind of like, yeah, it's close. But then he's like, I've got a real bona fide Levite with me now. This is legit now. That's where you see in verse 13, now I know the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite now as a priest. It says, now we're good. Is that good, by the way? No, we're not in the territory of good. Will the Lord prosper him because God's going to say, oh, well, hey, now that you have a Levite, this is great. No, this is not condoned by God. But that's the type of thing that you can expect when what? 18 verse 1. All right. When there is no king in Israel. So now we get to the story of Dan. And the people of Dan, they're sending scouts, it seems, to go and find a place. And if you were here on Thursday night, where did they find a place? All right, way up north, right? You know, their place was supposed to have been way down south, but instead they come up, they go through the hill country of Ephraim, and if, again, regular caveat, don't go by scale or anything like that. But you have Laish, which is like way up here. And this, I believe, is outside of the territory. Remember what it said about the people of Laish? They were unsuspecting people. They didn't have connections with the other peoples. They weren't the ones involved in what God was coming to punish. It was just a quaint little town. And so that's where this group comes and eventually goes up. But they stop. And they stop first at the place where Micah is. Let's see here. Let's start verse 3. When they were by the house of Micah, it says that they what? Chapter 18, verse 3. They recognize the voice of the young Levite. Now, does this stand out as odd to anybody else? I'm not the only one, right, where that's a little weird. What tribe are they? Dan. Where was this Levite? Well, before that, though, where did he come from? Bethlehem in Judah. Has he ever had a place among the Danites? Not that we know of, right? There's absolutely zero indication given anywhere that they should recognize this person's voice. And yet they say, whoa, hold on, I know that voice. Let's go and check this out, right? So they turned aside. They said, what are you doing here? What is your business here? And he says, well, hey, I got a good gig right here. Micah hired me. I'm now his priest. And so they say, oh, well, if you're a legitimate priest with Micah and his God and his ephod and everything else, then inquire of the Lord for us, right? Is this legitimate? Is he a legitimate prophet or priest of the Lord with his ephod and everything else? No, he is not. And so he said to them, go in peace. The journey which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Are you guys seeing problems here? Just all the way throughout, everybody's doing what? What's right in their own eyes. And, this is a yes man priest, right? Who's, hey, do you want to do this? Yeah, go do it. God's with you. Go have fun. So they depart. They bring back the rest of the people, the entire tribe of Dan, the army of Dan, verse 11, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol. Let's see here. Verse 13, they passed from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who went to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, in this house there's an ephod, household gods, carved image, a metal image. What should we do? Well, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to go take it. right? Why? Because in these days, what do people do? Whatever's right in their own eyes. And by the way, in a system where everybody gets to choose what is right for themselves, the power ultimately turns to whom? The powerful. The ones who have the bigger stick, right? Those are the ones in that type of a system who are going to rise to the top. Because there's no higher authority that's governing. Might makes right in that type of a system. So they bring this guy with them, and all of this stuff. They rob Micah of all of these things, and he's indignant about it. He comes out, in verse verse 18. The priest says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Hey, I tell you what, why would you want to be the priest for a house when you can be a priest for an entire tribe of people?" And we've already seen that this man, he left his rightful place as a Levite in Judah, right? He was assigned to the city of Bethlehem to serve the people there, but it wasn't good enough for him, so he sought out something better. And he found a place to be a priest in this house. Well, what do you think he's going to do with the opportunity to be the priest over an entire tribe of people? He's going to take it. And that's exactly what he does. Verse 22, when they'd gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house called out and overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted at the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What's the matter with you? Why do you bring such a group of people to us?" And Micah said, "You take my gods that I made and the priest, and you go away. What do I have left? And how then do you ask me, what's the matter with you?" And again, who has the power? Might makes right, right? So verse 25, the people of Dan said, "Shut up. Do not let your voice be heard among us." There's like, we have no dealing with you, lest angry fellows fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household. So the people of Dan went their way. And when Micah saw they were too strong, he had to give up. His illegitimate stuff has now been taken illegitimately from him. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made. The priests, they came to Laish, to a quiet, unsuspecting people, and struck them with the edge of the sword, burned the city with fire, and there was no deliverer. Or what? What's another word there for deliverer? There was no judge. We just read an entire book. I erased it. It was. Pretend that's still up here. We just read, you've just read this entire thing about how God would send deliverers when the oppressive people would come in and harm the ones that needed to be protected. And yet in this story, what side do God's people stand on? Who are they? They are the oppressors. And it's others who wish that they had a deliverer against God's people. You're supposed to, at this point, look at the tribe of Dan, the people of Dan, and say, shame on you. You are now acting like them. You're no longer acting like God's people who rely and trust upon God to be their deliverer. Now you are turning the tables and making others need a deliverer against you. And so they come in, they have no deliverer, and the people of Dan do whatever they want to do. Why? You would expect that when what? When everyone's doing what is right in his own eyes. So, it says that, verse 29, they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at first. And the people of Dan, they did what? All right, they set up a carved image in the city of Dan. I want you to take that little tidbit of information, and I want you to tuck it away if you got a little cubbyhole in your brain somewhere where you stick information that's going to be useful a few months down the road or however long it's going to be. I want you to be able to pull that out later. That the city of Dan, in the very beginning of Israel's story, in the city of Dan, they place a carved image. Everybody got that? All right. And then, let's see here. Verse 30, the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of, what do you guys have? Son of, how many of y'all have son of Manasseh? Raise your hands high. Take a look around. How many of you have the son of Moses? In a margin? Okay. All right. Now, why in the world would we have such a discrepancy? And by the way, has anybody heard of this issue before? Have you all talked about this? Is this something that's been discussed before? All right. Moses and Manasseh are basically the exact same name, except there is a very tiny letter that's added in that changes it from Moses to Manasseh. It's the N. You know, it's Moses or Manasseh, right? So that N that's inserted in there. So these names are very, very similar in what they look like. But there's two totally different things. Now, let's look at some of the circumstantial evidence that you have here. First of all, where are we in Israel's history with this narrative?
Sounds like what Judges actually are in action.
Yeah, we're right at the very beginning when they failed to take the land properly, right? So this is kind of that Exodus generation to some degree that's coming in. What are the names that are given here? Jonathan, who's the son of Gershom. Does anybody know another Gershom in the Bible? Okay. But Gershom is whose son? Gershom is the name of one of Moses' sons. So you have here Jonathan, who is the son of Gershom, which is a name that corresponds to the name of one of Moses' sons. And it's in the time frame that you would anticipate that he would be alive. By the way, from what tribe does Moses come? The tribe of Levi, right? Remember, his brother is Aaron the high priest. What about Moses? Is he the high priest? Oh, so is he even a priest? Nothing indicates that he is, right? And so you have the high priesthood, I mean, the priest of priests, and his line is right here, and yet there's no apparent demonstration that we see that Moses' line is elevated to that same type of a place, that they would be any more than any other of the Levites that we know, right? Does that make sense? So, this individual, is it perhaps, or let me say, what tribe does it say that he's from? Not a trick question. He's a what? He's a Levite, right? He's a Levite who was in Judah, in Bethlehem, and left. And that's why Micah was so excited. He had a true, bona fide Levite. Now, here's an interesting thing. remember that little tidbit of information that we saw earlier? The people who were there from Dan, what got their attention? The voice. Isn't it weird that the voice of a random Levite from Bethlehem might be recognized by people from Dan and Ephraim? Is it possible that maybe Moses' family is well known among the people and honored to some degree among the people, so that maybe Moses' sons, grandchildren perhaps, might be recognizable? Is that a higher possibility than knowing the voice of just some random individual? Does that point make sense? If this is Moses' grandson, there's a higher chance that his voice would be recognizable to anybody in Israel.
It's believable to me because I'm often mistaken on the phone for my mom and my children.
Okay, Becky just said it is believable to her because she's often mistaken on the phone for her mom and her children.
By my dad.
Oh, by her dad. Okay, well, yeah. All right. So there could be a family voice resemblance that is taking place. That when they hear a certain voice and they say, whoa, I'm going to check this out. I'm going to turn in. That makes a whole lot of sense. And yet, a lot of the manuscripts that we have, which remember, a lot of what we have pre-Dead Sea Scrolls comes from the Masoretic text. Have you guys talked about all of this type of stuff before? I don't want to delve into it if you haven't. But the Masoretes were the ones who put the vowel points on to try to preserve the Hebrew, and that's about around 900 AD, or AD 900. And so this is way after the stuff was written. And so there's a huge amount of time that takes place. And I haven't looked to see what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls or anything like that. But it is very common for this to read Manasses here instead of Massas or Manashua or Moshea or however it is. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, hold on. John, is this a longer comment?
No, not too long.
Okay. Well, we're waiting for Kelly to show up, so that's why. I want to make sure that everybody gets your full comment here. All right, go ahead, John.
If Joshua was of the generation of Gershom, which it sounds like, Joshua and Gershom lived in a time where the country was at peace after God gave them what he gave them in the land, and the people were enjoying their land really well, until all of those people and that generation that had walked with Moses and those people with Joshua, if I remember correctly, died. And then this next generation did exactly what we've been talking about tonight. Did not consider God in their thoughts at all, and just did what they wanted to do. So it kind of fits with what you're saying, that when Gershom was there, the people were more together ethnically and also devoted to God, because God was still their one king during that period of time, if Gershom is associated with the generation of Joshua.
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent, although I would say it's the same generation that fails to drive the inhabitants out.
Exactly. But
they never have peace that they enjoy.
They did do that, but I can't help it. I still accept the fact that the scripture says that they were living in peace and they were living in common unity. And then after they died, then all this disunity and going after idol worship and all that took place.
Yeah, I'm going to move on, but I am going to say that's the same generation. They're told, here are your lines, go drive the peoples out. And they don't sit around and enjoy peace, and then the next generation fails to drive them out. That's the generation that does not do what they're supposed to do. It's Joshua's, Gershom's, whoever. But this is, I think, to your point, this makes a lot of sense, especially for a young, brash guy who's not getting the due that perhaps he would want, type of a situation. But yeah, it's in those days where there is no king. So, all of this to say, why might you find a discrepancy in people putting the noon in there?
Kind of makes Moses look bad.
I think that's exactly it. I think this is a means of protecting, to some degree, the reputation of Moses, because this is a smear on him. And so it sounds a lot better to put in Manasseh than it does Moses. And so you ask the questions, which makes the most sense, or whatever the case might be. That seems to me to make a whole lot of sense, that to protect Moses, his reputation moving on through, you just add an N in there and it changes things. But I really do think, I'm now on the side that says, yeah, this probably is Moses' own grandson, which, by the way, if you're a storyteller, why don't you throw this information out in the very beginning? Yeah, Sean said it has more impact if you drop it in there later, right? There's more impact. You kind of hide his identity as if he's, just anybody, and then boom, you toss it in there. Oh, by the way, this is Moses' own grandson that's under discussion. And you're like, wow. I think that's what's going on here. All right. We spent more time on that than I wanted, but that's okay. So that brings us through the very first one. How does the next story begin? Chapter 19, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel, and a certain, what? Levite was sojourning where? In the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim. And you're like, okay, sounding familiar, right? Let's see if this story goes any better. Well, we're not going to get into all the ins and outs, but I do think it's important to at least bring out a little bit of this. So, you have this man who took for himself a concubine from where? Bethlehem in Judah. So we have a repetition now of the hill country of Ephraim, a repetition of the city of Bethlehem. And so she ran away from him, and he goes to get her back. And it takes a while before he can finally, get things going. We're not going to talk about all the ins and outs of that. But when they finally leave, as they are going to go home, they leave a little bit later, so they have to stop on the way. And as they are leaving, she says, "Come, let us turn to this city of the whom? Jebusites." All right? This isn't as important to remember, but it is interesting. What is the city of the Jebusites that we know about in Scripture? Okay, it's not Jerusalem yet, Jebus, right? But it's going to be Jerusalem. She says, let's go to this place that's right here. And he says, no, I don't want to go anywhere that's not part of our people. So instead, what city do they turn to? All right, instead they go to the city of Gibeah, which is in what group of people? The tribe of, all right, from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, if you're familiar with the story, then you know what happens there. If you're not, I'll let you read it on your own and spend some time looking to see the horrific events that take place in Gibeah. They are horrific. Think Sodom and Gomorrah, the city of Sodom. These are paralleled tales, by the way. You're supposed to read this and you're supposed to think Sodom, which, by the way, the problems in Sodom was not homosexuality. The problem in Sodom was the way that they treated people who were not them. It's the hospitality, the way that they demonstrated hospitality. That's the issue in Sodom. That's the issue here. It's not a homosexual issue. It's an issue of how you treat outsiders. That's the problem in both of these narratives. The problem, though, is that it doesn't get better when he leaves. It gets worse with the way that he then treats this concubine, what he does. And as you go through the story, basically in the next couple chapters, a civil war erupts. Everybody against Benjamin. Benjamin is nearly wiped out until finally they say, okay, enough is enough, but now we need to repopulate the tribe of Benjamin. But they'd all made a note that they would not give their wives to Benjamin. So they look around and say, hey, is there anybody who's not here? And it turns out that there is at least one city who did not answer the call, which is so ironic because now they're saying what we did was wrong, which means the people of this city were what? The ones who did not come, they were actually what? They were innocent. They were right. But they say, let's go punish them for not coming. It's kind of the thing. And what city is that? Anybody remember? Trying to find exactly where it is. Yeah, it's Jabesh Gilead. There it is. It's in chapter 21. All right, so the city of Jabesh, and that means the city of Jabesh that is in Gilead, which is Transjordan. It's on the other side of the Jordan. That's where the area of Gilead is, kind of like around in that area of sorts. So the city of Jabesh in Gilead, they say, hey, there's people over there. We need to go to them, and they use the language of conquest. We will utterly destroy them. Well, that's just language. It's not literally utterly destroy them, because they go in, and we know that because the city of Jabesh Gilead is going to continue. But they do steal wives, women from there to be wives. And then they're like, well, there's still not enough. There's a festival that's taking place around, I believe, Shiloh, unless I'm remembering that incorrectly. So why don't we... Yeah, verse 19. Behold, there's a yearly festival of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel on the east of the highway. So there's this festival, and women regularly at this festival, the virgins, they run out. We need to put them in there so they can go and steal these women away to be their wives. These are their answers that they're coming up with on how to deal with this. Does that sound messed up to any of you? Civil war, almost wiping out an entire tribe, taking down a city that they say was in the right, but they were in the wrong, so let's wipe them out and steal their women. Let's just steal women who are, these virgins. Yeah, this is all messed up. But this might be the type of thing that you would come to expect if what? If there is no king in Israel, and what? Everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Right. That's the key. When you think of Judges, and really chapters 17 through 21, this little bit, what is it setting up? What's the setup? What's that? I couldn't understand the first thing you said.
Saul becoming king.
Okay, it's setting up the monarchy, right? In those days, there's no king. This is, by and large, these chapters that are tacked on to the end here, this is an apology for a king. This is saying we need a king to rule over the people. Now and because looking at the time, now I know exactly how I'm going to play this. We're going to talk about Ruth next week. So we'll save that. Here's the thing, though. I just gave it. Where does Ruth fall in our Bible? Right after Judges. And it makes sense for Ruth to fall right after Judges because the story of Ruth, it happens in what time frame? In the Judges, right? Does anybody know where Ruth falls in the Hebrew Bible? It's not right after Judges. It's right after Proverbs in the writings. Ruth is not one of their historical books that they would say, or the writings of the prophets is what they call them. We would call them the historical books. They would say writings of the prophets. It's not there. Why would you have Ruth fall right after Proverbs? How does Proverbs end? With the discussion of the worthy woman, which, by the way, is a term that's used in what book? Ruth. And it describes not only Ruth, but also, not worthy woman, but the word worthy describes Ruth and Boaz both. And so you have the ending of Proverbs, and it goes from there, talking about a worthy woman, straight into a book about a worthy woman and what worthy looks like. Does that make sense? So that's why it's there. We put it, though, here for specific reasons, and we'll talk about those next week. But let's assume that Ruth does not exist at this spot in our Bibles, okay? And we just read a story in chapter 17 that begins, in those days there was what? Someone from the hill country of Ephraim, right? Did that go well? No. But then we're like, okay, there's a second story starting in chapter 19, right? And that one begins talking about somebody who's what? From the hill country of Ephraim. And we're like, well, this story's got to go better, doesn't it? It's actually what? It's actually worse. And now, as we're reading through this, we are conditioned that when we see a story that starts, there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim, what are we thinking? This is bad news. We don't see stories that start, there's a man from the hill country of Ephraim, and so we flip the page, and how does 1 Samuel start? There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim from where? Of the hill country of Ephraim. Now, if Ruth's not there, and you're going straight from Judges into 1 Samuel, and you're saying, oh no, not again. I don't think I can take much more of this, right? You have 17, you have 19, and then you flip the page and you're like, this has got to be different, doesn't it? This has got to be better, right? Is it? Y'all know this story, right? Is this one better? Whose origin story is this one? This is Samuel's origin story, right? This is where Samuel comes in. Is Samuel good or bad? He is extremely good and positive. He's one of the bright spots that you see within the narrative. When you come through here, you are conditioned by this point, by the end of Judges, you are conditioned to see this phrase and go, oh no, not again. But instead of bleak despair, full of those days where there is no king, instead what you get is the origin story of the kingmaker. It's the origin story of the king anointer. He is the one who's going to crown both of the first kings, and we're going to talk about those in a while. By the way, we're going to get bogged down in 1 Samuel. I'm sorry. Up through, once we get past David and Goliath, then we're going to speed up. Saul's account to me is so fascinating. And you guys are going to be stuck with me, bogging us down there, just like Genesis 3 all over again. I'm sorry. Just prepare for it. It's going to happen. But I do think it's going to be worth it because there's so much that's just really neat in Saul's story. But that's where we are as we get through this. Ruth, I don't think, is in a good spot. It's in a good spot. We'll talk about why it's in a good spot next week. But because of where it is, you miss that connection from Judges to 1 Samuel that you're supposed to see. These aren't just disjointed writings. This is the work of somebody who did a fantastic job of stitching together these two books in such a way that you go from the bleak despair of the Judges to a day when there is now a what in Israel? There is a king in Israel. And it's going to enter into Israel's brightest moment, which is just a flash in the pan before it goes away, but that's what it will be. All right, any questions or comments before we close up our discussion then for the evening? Okay, with that then, last few moments, we'll turn it over to Richard. Thanks a lot, guys. Good class.